Welcome to the Cross-Cultural Psych Podcast with Professor Paul Youngwin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here is Dr. Paul Youngwin Kim.
So today I have Dr. Ami Reyes here, who is a certified cultural intelligence coach who has trained over 500 leaders over 10 plus years in cultivating inclusive, thriving workplaces with proven strategies and systems. She's the founder of Success Culture Coaching and is passionate about helping leaders navigate cross-cultural dynamics and thrive in diverse work contexts. She is also the award-winning author of the book, Becoming All Things, a seasoned expert with a PhD in cross-cultural work, and the co-founder of two multicultural nonprofits. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, USA Today, NBCnews.com, and Good Morning America. That's really impressive. And so welcome, Michelle.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me. Just honored to be here and excited to talk with you today.
So excited to have you. And the first question, as I read in the bio, is that you're wearing so many hats these days. And when I follow you on social media, there's so many exciting things going on, and especially when it comes to training others in cross-cultural competence. I know that that's a passion of yours. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what you're up to these days?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe it's side work, but it's good and holy work. First of all, I'm a homeschool mom. I have an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old, and so it's fun because conversations on cultural intelligence are just part of our everyday life, and so it's kind of fun. My son, who's 8, he's at the point now where we're out in public, and he's like, "Okay, how can I be culturally intelligent right now?" And it's really cool that he's asking that, and I'm able to have those conversations with him just in the grocery store or on the way to church or whatnot. So that's really special. But in my professional work as a certified cultural intelligence coach, I have the joy of working with pastors, with Christians in the for-profit world, for missionaries. And what I love is that the work that I do with cultural intelligence, which is really just training on how to enhance your cross-cultural competencies, capabilities to just effectively navigate with people who are different from you. This can be used in so many ways. It can be used for leadership development. It can be used to train a staff or a board to really just better understand how they can all work together to accomplish their mission and values. It can be used as evaluation tools for missionaries being sent out or for church planters. So it's really just given me the opportunity to work with a wide range of people and to really help folks on the ground level hone in their goals, better understand what they're really good at. And I love that. I love to be able to affirm people and say, this is who you are. This is how God made you. This is your strengths. Lean into that. Here's areas of growth. And then really just be able to customize development plans for them to feel like they can really thrive where they work. So I'm absolutely loving it. It's a joy to be in this lane.
Wow. Yeah, I think you're really impressing me with your sort of work that is directly impacting people in their lives, right? So my next question is about how you're such an inspiration to those of us who dream about doing work that's outside of academia, right? And you're doing that. And I'm curious, like, what that's like for you. Like, how did you end up choosing this path that is what I would describe as non-traditional for someone who has a PhD, right? Someone who has pursued opportunities outside of the academic setting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's funny because when I was in grad school and I did my PhD at the University of Illinois at Chicago, but there was a lot of talk about versatile PhDs and how you can use your skills and knowledge that you're gaining your doctoral work for non-academic jobs. And I attended the seminars. I went to the workshops, but I never thought that would be me. I thought I was going to have a profession in the academy for 30 plus years. That was my dream. But then in 2017, while working as an associate professor at a local liberal arts university here, right outside of Austin, Texas, where we live, the humanities program went through a series of budget cuts, and I was not tenure tracked at the time. And so I got that heavy phone call from my department head saying, your position has been terminated because funds have been reallocated to the math and science programs. And, my job just kind of disappeared overnight during the Christmas break of 2017. And it was devastating at first. I was pregnant at the time with my second, and then I found myself, jobless, and my husband and I were early church planters at the time. We had just planted a church, a multicultural church, a few years prior. So I couldn't apply for other jobs in different cities, let alone states, right? We were tied to Austin, Texas, and no one was hiring. So it was a difficult time. And I really had to come to terms with, okay, well, what do I do now? I have these skill sets and these passions, but I'm located in this city. So, what do I do? And so I began shifting my work 2018 onward into more of that evangelical reflective space, since I was already doing work alongside my husband in the church planting context. And so I started taking what I had learned and had been teaching in terms of cross-cultural dynamics within my PhD program, and I had focused on cultural identity development from a global perspective, and really looking at border crossings and how people form cultural identities based off of memory and storytelling, and when they're speaking, second languages and things like that, and really trying to bring that intellectual and spiritual discourse together and in sort of the gospel-driven work that we do as Christians in the church space. And so it was a hard transition at first, because I was trained as an academic and I know how to write academic articles and do academic research. And then all of a sudden I was trying to write in the Christian living space. And that's a very different style of writing. So it took time to adapt, and just how to present myself and how to bring together research, but in a more like practical application, practical living type way. But I would say it's been totally worth it. Since 2021, I've published 2 books related to culture and race for the sort of Christian reflective audience, and, now bringing that same intersection of spiritual, intellectual into my coaching. So I think all that to say, if someone is listening to this and finds themselves in a similar versatile PhD situation, one, encouragement that there's life on the other side, and I think without a doubt, the abilities to critically think, to write, and to research, those will open so many doors for you. That has just given me a leg up. I remember my first writing gig, the editor I was talking to, she's like, wow, you know how to write.
Wow.
And I was like, yes, 7 years of grad school prepared me for that. So the skills you're learning now, if you step out of the academic space, can be used in so many incredible ways.
I love that terminology, versatile degree, right? That we typically are not trained to think that way. We are trained to think that there is a one path for PhDs, but I think to be able to think about all the possibilities, because we have those critical thinking skills and the writing skills, I think would be really important. So I really appreciate you highlighting that.
Yeah.
If I could quickly follow up, you mentioned writing being different when you're doing more public-facing writing. And obviously, you're masterful in doing so, right? And reading your books and also the articles that you put out. But did you receive any kind of additional mentoring or coaching to be able to write for more of a public audience? Or was that something that you just figured out on your own as you're writing?
Yeah. Well, I just did a lot of research. One of my favorite lines from, I promise this relates, but one of my favorite lines from The Martian, that movie with Matt Damon, where he's like stuck on Mars, and he's like, I don't know how to like survive, but I'm gonna research this, I'm gonna figure it out, or it's something like that. And I was like, yes, people with PhDs can research it and figure it out. And so that's what I did, is I kind of just thought through what new professional trajectory I wanted to have. I started studying and researching the people who were in that field already, other, in particular, female speakers, writers, teachers. And I started researching their resumes. I started kind of thinking through, okay, where have you written? And what did you write? And reading their pieces, and then beginning to practice writing in that vein, reading what they were reading. And it was kind of a slow, transformative process, if you will. But there was clear intentional work to think through which waters do I want to be in, and how do I adapt myself to to succeed in those waters. So I didn't have like a mentor or a coach or anything like that, but that was an example where research served me really well.
Yeah, something that you know how to do well, right? As
Yes.
a PhD, right? But yeah, I think you used the word, but intentionality is still important. That even though you didn't have that one person tutoring you or mentoring you, right? You were intentional in doing the research and seeing templates that are out there, examples that are out there. And so
Exactly.
in the past, other guests have talked about similar intentionality where it didn't just passively happen where they transitioned to more public-facing writing, but rather, like one guest talked about having a colleague just critique their work all over the place and how that was in some sense, hurting their pride because they're established scholars in their disciplines. But on the other hand, they were able to see how that was necessary for them to grow in this writing for a more wider audience. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I recognized in jumping from academic to non-academic spaces, I was starting from ground zero again, right? Like I wasn't an established name or voice at that time. And so when I was getting editorial feedback, hey, we'd preferred if you take your article in this direction, or hey, can you cut that whole section out and say this instead? And yeah, it's like, no, this is what people need to hear.
Right.
I put a lot of thought into this, but kind of just recognizing, no, I need, kind of like being back in grad school, like I need to pay my dues. I need to work with these editors, write in a way that will serve their audience best as they're telling me it will. And over time, then be able to eventually have more freedom to write the way I'd like to. But yeah, you can't really be picky, particularly when you're starting out. You need to be able to cast the net wide and work with the editors and their feedback, receiving that constructive feedback.
Yeah, really good insights. And you described it, but this attitude of humility is so important, right? Where, we'll talk about humility in other contexts, like cross-cultural contexts, but even when it comes to relearning something, that humble posture is super important in being able to be receptive to feedback, right?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah. So you mentioned your book. I have your book here, right? Just
nice.
a great read. Our listeners, if you haven't read it, I encourage you to pick it out. But I'm going to read a quote from the book because I thought that was, I think, a central part of your argument. And it's from page 152. So I'm now reading. In 1 Corinthians 9:22, Paul writes, "To the weak I became the weak to win the weak." What Paul is saying here is revolutionary. He is telling us that when it comes to caring for the weak, i.e. the poor and oppressed in our society, we need to become them. Can you say a bit more about this posture of becoming? What does it mean to become someone, especially as a person who is not from that culture?
Yeah, for sure. There's a term I use in my book about being a cultural chameleon. And I talk a lot about just in my own life as an Indian American growing up, feeling like a cultural chameleon, if you will. And so I like to equate this biblical concept of becoming all things to all people as akin to becoming a cultural chameleon. And what I mean by that is that becoming all things, and I think I explained this in my book as well, it's this posture, but it's also this capacity to see the world through other people's eyes and to value what they value and really to honor and care for their way of life. And so especially when it comes to becoming like the weak, the oppressed, the vulnerable in society, like you said, this is going to require a healthy dose of humility and flexibility, because we have to challenge ourselves to not just insert our own experience or our own background to say, well, this was my struggle, here's how I got out of my struggle, therefore they should be able to get out of their struggle in the exact same way. And I think that's oftentimes that very reductive thinking is what prevents us from extending care, because we're seeing people through our own lens. And so we really need to be able to get out of our comfort zone and do things that we might not ordinarily do, build relationships with people that we might not ordinarily, be in friendship circles with. And I think an example of that is just our church in Austin, Texas. We're a primarily immigrant church. We're fully bilingual, English and Spanish. And God has just opened up doors for us this year and last to host a lot of immigrant families in our home. And that was unexpected. Something at first that I wasn't sure how to feel about. We support a lot of missionaries at the border, and it just kind of developed over time that as they were helping immigrants work through their paperwork, legally cross the border, that they'd enter into this country and they'd know nobody, like zero contacts, no sponsors, nothing. And so what our missionary friends started doing is putting them on a bus to Austin and we would go pick them up. And all of a sudden our home became this way station for immigrants to get on their feet, get a job, start making money, all that kind of stuff. And so I remember the first time it happened, it was a whirlwind. It was like Good Friday. Our missionary friends had just texted us like an hour before, like, hey, by the way, I just put some people on a bus and they're coming to your house. And I remember just turning to my husband, Aaron, and thinking, like, is this even a good idea? Like, I have no picture of these people. I don't know what they look like. I don't even know what their names are.
Right.
Can we trust them? Is this going to be safe? How long are they going to stay with us? Am I cooking for them? Like, none of those questions were, and like, we just didn't know. And we're inviting these strangers into our house. And, a lot of those fears were just quickly assuaged. All of the families that have stayed with us have just been wonderful people, many of whom have been Christians themselves, who have taken care of us, who have loved on our kids, who have cooked for our family. And now, like this past 7 or 8 months, we've hosted immigrants from Russia, Colombia, Spain, Venezuela. We have a Venezuelan family living with us right now. And to me, this is what God has called our family to right now, in terms of caring for the vulnerable, learning to become like the vulnerable. But that first step, I think, really is just a willingness to put ourselves in the path of the poor and the vulnerable, to build relationships and then begin to see life through their eyes. So in no way am I saying that other people need to be doing what I'm doing or that our family is doing, but I think the question that we all have to ask ourselves is, what relationships are we building right now with the poor and the vulnerable? Whose paths are we putting ourselves in so that we can really be able to meet the poor and the vulnerable and care for them for the sake of the gospel?
Yeah, I'm thinking about that image of, like, that phrase you're using that conjures up the image of putting ourselves in someone's path, right? Because we sometimes think that that is like interrupting someone or like getting in the way of someone, but actually that image is more about being intentional about connecting with others, right? Being relational. And the other powerful thing that you said was welcoming the stranger into our homes. And gosh, what a powerful way that you're doing that. So really appreciated what you shared of what it means to have a posture of becoming.
Amen. Yeah, my one thing that I am grateful for is kind of a side note, if you will, but just the fact that we are now raising kids age 8 and age 5 who they spend the majority of their day around people that don't speak English, and so that is so normal for them. There is no like bias for them to be like, why don't you speak English? And in fact, it's taught in terms of like this posture becoming, it's taught them, just because of experience and proximity to immigrants, that they need to learn the other person's language and be able to connect with them, where they're at, as opposed to expecting them like, hey, why don't you learn English and talk to me? And so, those sorts of postures, that type of cultural flexibility, there's only so much you can learn by reading a book. The rest really gets worked out in practical relationships, and that's why that's so important.
Yeah. And you've described that your work is within the church, but also outside of the church with other believers. And I'm just curious to hear from you as to what it's been like to do this kind of cross-cultural work in the Christian setting, and what are some of the rewards and challenges that might come up in doing this kind of work in Christian communities?
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think there's a pattern of conversations that I'm noticing happening, whether the person is white, black, brown, or mixed, whether the person is a pastor or a director. There's a lot of anxiety around what people as individuals bring to the table, the value of their voice, what they're able to contribute in cross-cultural spaces. And so a lot of the sort of foundational work that I do with people is really just affirming who they are, affirming their God-given cultural identities. And I think that's why, to an extent, I'm not like most of the folks that you're going to find in DEI spaces, including Christian DEI spaces. And that's because I draw very hard lines in the sand on what are gracious and non-gracious forms of communication and sort of rules of engagement, if you will. And so I tell the people that I work with, or sometimes I post on social media, like, you're never going to hear from me a call to shame somebody or to bully somebody or to just outright dismiss or try to cancel somebody simply because they hold a different viewpoint from you. And the reason I draw that hard line, it does come back to my faith, and it does come back to this idea in Ephesians 4:29 about not letting any unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, but only that which is edifying and grace to those who hear you. And there's other passages in scripture that talk about having your words seasoned with grace and so on. And so I truly believe, particularly as leaders, you cannot be in the business of cross-cultural work and racial engagement simply to burn people, or certainly to burn everything down. Like, we have to think in terms of legacy. What are we building up? How are we improving the lives of the people around us? How are we seeking the common good in our personal and professional lives? So, on the one hand, that message has gotten even, myself canceled from certain folks, and that's okay. I don't actually care about that. But what I do care about, and to your question about what is rewarding in this work, is seeing people feel equipped and empowered to really do the holy work of DEI, working towards inclusivity, belonging, cultural intelligence, and to do it first and foremost, or primarily leading with the love of God and love of others, and that means that their approach is going to look very different from what we see in the world. And that's a good and beautiful thing. And so I have people reach out every single week, whether it's via email or DMs, just thanking me for being gracious, for being thoughtful, for being nuanced. And not only are they happier human beings for taking this posture, but they also are seeing that they're able to have a greater, more positive impact. And that's really, that's what really gets me excited.
I love the fact that you are first and foremost starting out with a gospel-centered perspective, right? Focused on love of God and love of people, and then allowing that to lead to gracious conversation. So like you said, that's in some sense not the typical DEI work that we see in our world today, where conversation is often very much about taking sides. And so, I'm appreciating that sort of countercultural aspect of what you're proposing and what you're doing.
Amen. Amen. The minute that you can no longer have a conversation with somebody you disagree with, any possibility for productive conversation, any possibility for forward moving progress goes out the window. And I think we need to remember that it's not about, getting into these echo chambers and silencing everyone that we don't like. I talk to people all the time. They're like, well, I know what not to do. They have this long list of like, well, don't say this, don't do this. Like, here's all the things that's going to get me upset. But that the counter list of like, here's what to do, here's how we're investing and giving of ourselves and building, that's a very scarce list, and we need to flip the script a bit on what we're doing and why.
Good point. Have you ever had people question the validity of cross-cultural or DEI work from a Christian perspective? Meaning, like, I've had those reactions too, where people have commented, like, on an article, well, DEI work is incompatible with Christian faith, right? And there's a lot to unpack there. But have you ever had that experience? And how do you respond to folks who say
100%, right? And I think we all saw that to agree with the pandemic and the rise of anti-Asian racism during the time of COVID, and people and the summer of 2020 with George Floyd and people asking those questions of like, how is justice, what is the relationship between justice and the gospel, right? And so I've been having these conversations for a good number of years. And I think now, particularly in cultural lanes, the conversation is, how is cross-cultural engagement, how is it on mission, right? That's a big one. Is this in alignment with our mission as an organization? Or sometimes people will say, well, I already love God and I already love others. Why do I need to do cultural training? Or, let's just focus on the gospel. Let's just focus on like biblical pillars and ideals. Or I think the last big hurdle is people saying, well, cultural training is probably good for missionaries, but I'm not a missionary. Therefore, I don't need this type of training. So it's kind of a spectrum of objections depending on who you're talking to and what their context is. And I think when it comes to Christians, it's just so important to go straight to scripture instead of debating and then saying, well, you're wrong. And I don't even just respond to objections with like, well, let me point you this passage. I actually like to spend a lot of time just asking open-ended questions. Questions like, well, tell me more about that, or what made you come to that decision, or if they feel like they're really hostile, what that clues you into the fact that they've had a negative experience. So taking that direction, what sort of negative experiences have you had in cross-cultural work or racial engagement? Where do you wish the conversation would go? So you start to hear their fears, you start to hear their dreams, and then you come alongside and say, well, do you think that if there was a theological foundation for this work, that would actually be able to achieve, whatever it is that they're actually passionate about? And then all of a sudden they're like, well, yeah. And the conversation opens up. So I think if we can meet people where they're at first and foremost, really get to the heart of what they're frustrated about or worried about, and then come in and say, well, here's how the gospel, meets you there. There is such a wonderful, like, positive receptivity to that. And so that's kind of my encouragement for folks who get, on the flip side, I talk to folks all the time. They're like, I'm so frustrated with my colleagues. Like, why are they so culturally unaware? Why don't they get it? Why don't they care? And so to, kind of tell them, instead of just coming straight in with the education, I think the more we can ask those open-ended questions, really get to know people and personalize our approaches to them, doors open up from there.
Yeah. I think you're giving lots of insights into how your experiences and the lessons you have learned will translate to the classroom as well, right? How to listen to students, how to maybe not directly counter, at least not immediately, with contrary evidence, right? Because that's sort of my inclination, that if they say, oh, microaggressions are not a big deal, my first inclination is to show them, well, actually, there's all this literature that shows that it is a big deal, right? But you're saying that sometimes it's about really trying to get into their internal frame of reference, right? And to empathize and listen to where they might be coming from.
Yeah, 100%. People oftentimes make these like really broad stroke generic comments that on the surface level feel very problematic, right? And you kind of you feel like these red flags are going off, for like, oh no, this person cannot think this way. And then you actually get to know them and you realize they had like one really, really bad personal experience, and now they're just sort of like putting out these broad stroke statements because of that one experience that they had. And so if you can kind of address that, their tune changes very quickly. And so I think we have to kind of just put that red flag radar off to the side for a moment and kind of calm down and not panic and not respond from a place of fear ourselves. And the conversation usually becomes more productive.
And just to follow up on that, Michelle, have there been times though when conversations were not productive, even if you gave it your best effort? And maybe even sometimes, and I'm speaking from my experience as an instructor too, sometimes I've had to set some boundaries, right? Draw some relational boundaries with, for example, students, because of the continued microaggressions, right? Things that were maybe not healthy in the relationship. And so to the degree that you feel comfortable, could you share a bit about like maybe an example of where you've had to draw some boundaries?
Oh, 100%. I think the most drastic example is actually when I used to be a professor, and I was teaching it was a course that had to do with feminism and revisionist literature and all this sorts of stuff, which was always so fun to teach. But there was one particular male student in the class that just didn't seem to like anything that I said. And I couldn't tell if it was it me being a female professor? Was it the content? Was it the mix of cross-cultural dynamics and feminist theory? Like, where so many things that could have been a trigger. But I remember one time he got so angry that he like charged the front of the classroom. And at that point, I was like, okay, I need to talk to my higher ups. And the point of being gracious has kind of hit its ceiling, and now I need to bring in, HR. So obviously you need to like have consideration for your physical safety, for your own emotional health and things like that too. I do think, I think that there are some folks that they just love the sound of their own voice, and no matter what you say, it's going to kind of fall on deaf ears, and they're just going to kind of keep parroting their own thoughts and getting more and more aggressive as they do. And for those situations, I just kind of tell myself the point of connection, at least right now for this person, is not going to be established. And so I kind of step back in those moments, and I don't keep weighing in. I just kind of let let the person have their say and move on. But then again, if that aggression ramps up, then it's like, okay, we need to take this outside the classroom. We need to potentially bring in the department head or the higher up. So I think it's good to know, you're not trying to win every student. You're not trying to have forward moving progress with every conversation. There always will be those students or those colleagues where the conversation just hits a point where you're like, at least for now, we can't continue with this. And that's okay too.
Yeah. Giving them space, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a scary example, Michelle, what you described. I've never had anything close to that happen to me. But I also think sometimes like the withdrawal from the conversation, like in a classroom where you see students being super passive or maybe even intentionally just psychologically withdrawing from any kind of dialogue, that can also kind of, I guess, suck my energy into trying to get them to re-engage, right? And it's not like someone charging at me, but it does feel like sometimes I have to draw that boundary as well, so that one student or the couple of students in the classroom are not taking up so much of my psychological energy, right? And so giving them a bit of space, right? And being willing to let them be for a bit, right? So that I can take care of the other students as well.
Yeah. 100%. And to actually give the majority of your energy to the engaged, enthusiastic, dialed in students, because they're the ones that are invested. They're the ones that actually want to take the work from the classroom into their, real lives. And that's what's life-giving. And I think we've all seen that, not only just in the classroom, but I think that translates across the board. Pastors with congregations, directors with teams and staffs, that if they end up focusing on that small group of people that are the most resistant and the most difficult, I mean, that's the fast track to burnout, right? And so we have to keep all of the different dynamics in mind, who might be struggling, who might be kind of falling off the map, while still giving that majority energy to the ones that are dialed in, so that our work continues to be life-giving and energizing.
Yeah. No, I think you make an excellent point that, it's helpful for our own energy and process as we're teaching, right? That we need also that kind of positive feedback from folks as we're teaching, right? And to always go after those few who are kind of resistant can be sucking the energy out of us. So really appreciate that perspective. You've already shared some, Michelle, but because you have so much experience in organizational settings and working with leaders, for example, I'm wondering if there are lessons you have learned, like really critical lessons you have learned in those settings that will also translate well to a higher education classroom, like at a Christian university, for example.
Yeah, well, talking with you, talking with other leaders in different fields that are already like dialed into the work of cross-cultural engagement, DEI, like the passion is already there. What I like to tell folks that I work with is that, to really be successful in DEI work, to be successful in cross-cultural engagement, there's three pillars that'll set you up for success. The first is education, the second is experience, and the third is evaluation. And oftentimes people can be really good at pillar number one and or pillar number two. Right. And I think probably in the higher ed space, pillar number one of education is thriving, right? Like we've got the books, we've got the research, we're trying to dial into histories and movements and patterns and all of these sorts of things. And I think a lot of professors, particularly in the space, are also dialing into experience. They're trying to ask those questions of how are we empowering students to move from the classroom out into their neighborhoods or communities, meeting real people, doing cross-cultural work, so it's not just theoretical, right? And even I love what I'm hearing from some teachers, some professors about thinking outside the box for assignments, not just writing essays or articles, but maybe a talking head video of their experience, kind of B-roll footage, whatever it is that they're doing to show what their experience was like in a different cultural environment, what they learned from that. But the third pillar that's really helpful for success is evaluation. And I think a great question for folks in higher ed to be asking is, what sort of evaluation tools are you using and implementing when it comes to DEI work? Not just for you, but the students that you're interacting with, your colleagues. And I don't just simply mean those evaluations at the end of those course evaluations. Right. I'm talking about cultural assessments, things like a cultural intelligence assessment, or, maybe you've heard the term IDI or things like that, where you're really getting an idea of your cultural strengths, your areas of growth, if you will, what kind of ongoing development plan is in place for your classroom, for you as an educator in the space that you work and teach. And so if you only have education and experience, you can only go so far. You need all three working together for you to truly have that success that you're looking for.
As you know, in higher ed, we evaluate ourselves to death sometimes, or at least it feels like it. But so little of that has to do with cultural intelligence, right? So I think that feeds back into your point that we need more of that. What's encouraging in my department is we started to require faculty to reflect on DEI in their professional development plan. And that's been, I think, really good in holding faculty accountable and allowing them to grow in that very important area. Traditionally, we've only reflected on our scholarship, teaching, and service, but not explicitly like a DEI as a category. But now we're starting to require that. And I think that's been really helpful.
Yeah. Oh, that's excellent. Things like, for example, a cultural intelligence assessment. I think that would be a wonderful resource for professors, but also like in the work that you're doing, you're teaching cross-cultural psychology in courses where DEI is directly integrated. I think it would be even interesting to have a class of students go through a CQ assessment at the beginning of the course, and where they not only get individualized reports of where they're at, but if you do as a group, to get a group report, and there's this immediate baseline understanding of, okay, who's in the class? What cultures are being expressed? Where are there similarities? Where are there points of difference to be mindful of in terms of preventing cross-cultural miscommunication or conflict? And then even for professors to have that kind of knowledge to be able to slightly adapt how they teach or what they include in their curriculum. I speak of that outside of academia right now. So, finances and all of that, I don't know how that works, but, I think those are the types of things that would allow professors just to be able to kind of get that edge in terms of continuing to adapt and focus their content to the specific students in the seats in their classroom.
No, I think that's an excellent point. And maybe even do like a post-class or post-semester or post-quarter assessment and contrast where the students were at the beginning of the class and then where the students end up after the class.
Yes.
I think some of us are doing that kind of assessment because individually we want that, but to have a sort of a university-wide effort like that or department-wide effort, I think that would be really worthwhile.
Yeah, I do too. I think it'd be really cool to implement
Yeah.
and see how that improves understanding. It's all linked, right? The more that you can understand the impact that you're having in the classroom, it impacts your professional development and curriculum development and all these sorts of things. So,
and you mentioned something that's really important to me, which is not replicating the exact same thing every quarter, but instead getting a sense of where the students are and to the degree possible, tailoring my teaching to meet those students' needs, right? Because each quarter, the students are going to be very different, right? And so to be able to be flexible in that regard, I think is so important and frankly, hard to do given our limited resources.
No, it's so true. I mean, you see every semester, it's like a different percentage of male to female students. It's a different percentage breakdown wise in terms of ethnic representation, even generationally a little bit, right? Like, are these a bunch of incoming freshmen? Are these seniors? I don't know if you can call that generation, but just age gap, if you will. And so, yeah, it was a question that I was constantly asking. And granted, I had the benefit of having smaller classrooms when I was in academia. I was teaching courses that were anywhere from like 15 to 30 students. And so I knew my students really well and could adapt on some of those more macro levels. But I think it's something just for educators to constantly be thinking about.
For sure. Yeah. 15 to 30 sounds like a really good number. Yeah. I mean, at SPU, I also teach smaller classes, but typically my cross-cultural psych class is 35 students or maybe a couple more, like 37.
Sure.
I wish that like sometimes I could teach 15, like going from 35 to 15 feels like a really sweet kind of a reduction in terms of the types of relationships I can have with students and the types of pedagogical tools I can use with students.
Yeah, absolutely. And the amount of invested conversation that happens in those smaller classrooms too.
Yeah. Again, if you're comfortable discussing this, Michelle, I know that you're open about your ethnicity as an Indian American, like you talk about it in your book, for example, and you mentioned it at the beginning of our interview today. How do you bring in your cultures into your DEI work, meaning certainly your ethnicity, but also other aspects of your identities into your DEI work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mentioned I'm bicultural. So my mom is 100% ethnically Indian, and she's part of the Indian diaspora. So she wasn't born in India. She was born in Uganda, Africa. And my dad is of German and British descent. So, he's blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and I'm a mix of both. I'm married to a second-generation Mexican American. So we're raising these sort of Caucasian, Mexican, Indian children. We do ministry in an immigrant context because of the life experiences and my work in grad school. I speak 7 languages. We've lived in different parts of the world. My husband and I lived in Germany for a while. We lived in Scotland for close to 3 months last year. And, just from my life experiences, just from my own family, I think it was very clear to me from a fairly young age that the world is really big. I had and even still now today, I have a very acute understanding of my small place in a very big world and just how many people there are out there who are different from me. And I think so often when it comes to US American conversations on culture and race, we can get so siloed into thinking about race relations in terms of Black people and white people, right? Or talking about oppression or immigration or things like that from a very localized US American context. And I think just because of my life experiences, when I'm thinking about these issues of diversity and multiculturalism, even topics like oppression and slavery, my mom's great grandparents were brought as forced laborers by the British Empire to Uganda to build the railroad in Uganda and then also in Kenya. So those sorts of global understandings of these issues, I think are just, it's more of what we need in our conversations today. And it's what I try to bring to the table, is to affirm where people are at, but also try to help them expand their thinking beyond just their own localized experience or their culture's localized experiences, to think, okay, how can you understand yourself in relationship to other people? So I think that's a lot of the work that I do, is just trying to expand the conversations. But yeah, and I think I'll just say that. But I think the more that we can focus on expanding conversations, and in particular preventing any sort of competition of suffering, competition of hurt or grief, and understanding that all of our histories have pain and suffering in very different ways, and that we need to make space for all of that at the table.
Right.
I just think the more productive our efforts will be.
That's really well put. The idea that we're not competing for resources, right? But rather that we can make space at the table for all voices, right? Like I've heard people use the term like oppression Olympics. It's not a competition. It's not Olympics of who, like, it doesn't take away from other people's oppression to talk about our group's oppression, right? Our experiences of oppression. So, and your emphasis on global perspective is so appreciated as well. I don't know if I shared at any point, but I grew up in the Philippines as a missionary kid. So I, of course, then appreciate the missionary training that you're doing, because I think that's a really needed area. And just because you become a missionary doesn't mean that you are prepared cross-culturally, right? So you need the kind of training that you're providing. But I have all these complicated identities that on the surface, people might not recognize, right? But to be able to bring all of that into my work is something that I'm trying to do, right? That as a Korean who grew up in the Philippines, attending a almost all white school for the majority of my life, right? And in a very evangelical setting, and then coming to the US as an international student, but now as a naturalized US citizen, all of that, I hope can be helpful in the DEI work that I do, right? And I'm trying to bring all of that in. Yeah.
Amen. And I love that, and I love getting to know more of your story. And I think something that I say in my book, and I think this is true for all people, because I'm Indian American, I say I am like all Indians, I am like some Indians, and I'm like no other Indian. The same is true with your story. And I think it's so important for us to know what histories we're living into,
Right.
what stories we're living into, but also the fact that we are making a unique contribution into those stories, and to hold both, one in each hand.
Yeah, definitely.
It's an interesting time to be an Asian American Christian in the US. I think because there's a lot of research and reports coming out about how Asian American Christians are one of the fastest demographics to be leaving the church, so they're becoming unchurched. So there's kind of this there's like this issue within Asian American Christianity of okay, how do we care for this demographic? But then of course within the larger conversation in sort of US racial histories and cross-cultural engagement, oftentimes Asian Americans are overlooked. And then there's the side part of, where do Indians, where do South Asians fit into this? And I remember growing up, and even in my 20s, people wouldn't know what to call me. They're like, "Are you Asian-ish?" So I was like, "Yeah, what am I? Am I Indian? Yeah, I'm Indian. Am I South Asian, Desi, Asian American?" I think these terms are all very helpful. They all express different identifications and proximity to other groups, right? I think that's really important to understand, is when we call ourselves Asian American, or we call ourselves South Asian, or whatnot, we're expressing a certain proximity, the people that we have affinity with. My mom, for example, she's first generation Indian American. She is Indian, not Asian. And she's very adamant about that. She's like, I don't want to be called Asian because I'm Indian. And there are first generation dynamics at play there. And that sort of association with her cultural group over US American nationality, all of that is at play. But for me, I'm okay utilizing a term like Asian American because of its political origins and its affirmation of proximity to other Asian demographics as a form of racial solidarity, of showing up for each other, particularly in terms of distress and crisis. There's no one size fits all identification for folks within the Asian American, South Asian, Indian demographic. But I think that's an important conversation to have. I think it's an important conversation to figure out how to help Asian immigrant churches thrive, because there's a lot of disconnects happening between first, second, and third generation.
Right.
And so there's a lot of need right now and a lot of opportunities to weigh in and care.
For sure. No, this is really great that you're speaking into this, and you're highlighting the tension that I see in my communities, which is on one hand, this need for a pan-Asian ethnicity and the solidarity with one another, right? And how even from the perspective of the Asian American community is viewed as Asian by others outside of it, the Asian American community, right? So there is this strong identity that we're part of this Asian group, but also on the other hand, it's a very diverse group, right? And we shouldn't homogenize the experiences of Asian Americans, right? And that there are unique challenges within the Asian community when you disaggregate that data, whether it's, I don't know, educationally, in terms of socioeconomic status, mental health concerns, there are all these unique challenges that come up within Asian communities that we need to recognize. So I appreciate your sort of nuanced perspective.
And I'll add this real quickly, because I'm second generation, I just feel like when I was in my early 20s, I felt the way that a lot of vocal second-gen immigrant children are, about being frustrated with your parents and why were they not more active, and all these communication and identification disconnects, and really just placing a lot of the blame on my parents. And I felt like the older I got, the more I did my own sort of cultural identity development work, the more I weighed into issues of race and culture, having children, all of these things, I have felt like over time I have learned to be far more compassionate and understanding with my parents, with my mom, with the way that she views the world. And so I do feel like I feel very passionate about wanting in particular to help second gen immigrant children like myself to consider staying at the table, not just leaving. How do we make this work? How do we give tools for first gen to better communicate across generational divides, to become perhaps more flexible to cultural dynamics that are at work here within the US American context, and at the same time help keep second gen at the table. So that's, I think, a lot of the sort of behind the scenes conversations that I'm having right now.
Such important work. Yeah, I like the idea that it's not just about teaching older folks or the older generation to acquire, I guess, more cultural flexibility, but it's also about the other side, right? The younger folks learning to relate to the older generation. So really appreciate
with greater
that perspective.
Understanding and compassion. Yes.
Yeah, compassion, and just realizing that, hey, our parents and our grandparents, they did the best they could, right? With the knowledge they had, the experiences that they had.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have two questions that I'll ask all guests, so I'll try to get to them quickly. My first question is, what advice might you have for Christian educators, such as PhDs, who are just beginning their careers, those who are just starting out their teaching and researching careers?
Yeah, well, I'll share the best advice that I received when I was first starting out, and it was this: aim for 100 rejections a year. And the idea is that you're constantly putting yourself out there, whether that's job applications or places to write or publish or research or, fill in the blank, but just try things. Be open to anything. I think so oftentimes we can create these almost like lists in our head of, we only want to publish with these journals, or we only want to speak at these conferences, or we only want to be known for, these topics or interests or, whatnot. But you don't even know what possibilities are out there if you limit yourself up front and just say, no, these are the only 3 things I'm going to do. And that was really good advice for me, because when I started out, I just cast the net really wide. And I found myself attending conferences that even some of my colleagues were like, why would you speak at that conference? Like, it doesn't have the prestige, or it doesn't have the, fill in the blank. And I just found that wherever I went, I was always building relationships. I was always building networks, making new friends. And even now, some of those networks that I built early on, some of those places that kind of gave me my first start and I collaborated with, they've played a huge role in my professional path in ways that I would have never even imagined had I just outright said no. So aim for 100 rejections a year. Just put yourself out there, see which doors God opens.
Wow, thank you for that challenge, right? I'll jot that down. Aim for 100. That's scary, but also really good for me to hear. And my last question is, because you, and actually I don't know who this person will be either. So if you could ask my next guest any question about teaching of DEI topics, it can be a fun one, it can be a really difficult question, because you don't have to answer it. Yeah. What might it be? What might be a question that I can throw at the next guest?
That's a fantastic question. I think one of the things that's always circulating in my mind is, how do you get folks to excitedly volunteer for DEI work? And, we've all seen the data that mandated trainings, being voluntold to show up and engage with certain new procedures or policies, it just doesn't work. You're not going to see that transformational lifestyle change. People are going to be doing it just as a checkbox and move on with their life. And so the key to like transformative, life-changing DEI work is to get people to want to show up, to want to do the work because they see the benefits, because they're motivated. That's when the magic happens. That's when you see organizations begin to change from the ground up. So the question remains, how do we get people to excitedly volunteer and show up for DEI work? So please leave that to your next guest, and I'll listen into the podcast episode to hear the answer.
Please let me know as well, because that seems like $1 million question. It's really hard to find people to volunteer for anything, especially when it comes to something like DEI work. So great question. Michelle, it's been amazing. Do you have anything else you'd like to say before we stop the conversation?
Well, one, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for this conversation. I hope that it is encouraging for your listeners. And for anybody who perhaps is listening in and is interested in learning more about taking a cultural intelligence assessment, learning more about their own cultural awareness, cultural strengths, cultural weaknesses, wanting to grow in these areas, feel free to reach out. My email is michelle@successculture.net, and be happy to even just hop on like a free strategy session call and learn more about your goals, how CQ could serve you in your context.
Thank you for listening to the Cross-Cultural Psych Podcast with Dr. Paul Youngman Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you will join us next time.